Talking Bottom. I'm Paul Tanter.
I'm Ange Pearson.
And I'm Matt Brooks.
And we are joined this week by a very special guest. He's best known for his prolific writing work, having written plays, screenplays, novels, and for video games. He was the ghostwriter of Rik Mayall's best-selling spoof autobiography, Bigger Than Hitler, Better Than Christ, and in 2024 he wrote and presented the hour-long documentary Panglobal Phenomenon for BBC Radio 4, which was based on his archive of over 100 hours of recordings of himself and Rik talking. He is currently researching and writing the authorised biography of Rik Mayall for Penguin Viking, which is currently scheduled to be published in March 2028, around when would have been Rik's 70th birthday. Max Kinnings, welcome and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you talking bottom with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Most people would recognise your name and know you best as the ghostwriter for, at the moment anyway, for Bigger Than Hitler, Better Than Christ. Can you tell us how that came about?
So I'd worked in marketing and advertising for comedy and music, and theatre, but mainly comedy during the late 80s and early 90s. So I'd done advertising for people like Avalon and Off the Curb, people like that, Phil McIntyre promotions particularly, and obviously Phil McIntyre promoted Rik and Aid in Bottom and various other shows. I'd been involved with the marketing, for example, of Waiting for Godot. The first time I ever met Rik was in 1991. At the opening night party. That was a great night. So I'd been sort of knocking around the comedy industry for a while. I'd ended up at Avalon as a marketing manager. And then I had a couple of books published, a couple of novels published, one called Hitman and one called The Fixer. And they were sort of comedy thrillers. And I had a bit of film interest in The Fixer, which was about a showbiz agent who manages a serial killer as though he's a celebrity. A friend of mine who was sort of mentoring me said, why don't you write a script? Why don't you, put something together? And so I decided to write a spoof documentary called The Murderers, because obviously The Office had been very big, and that sort of concept of the spoof documentary was quite a thing at the time. So I wrote this thing, and he said to me, this is my friend Mark, he said, why don't you send this to Rik Mayall? He'd be great as this mannered, sort of very British suburban psychopath alongside this kind of Texas chainsaw wielding madman who he lives with. And so I did, thinking nothing of it, thinking, well, who am I? I've just written a couple of novels. And then I got a call from Ord Powell, Rik's legendary agent. And she said, Rik loves this. Why don't you go along to his house and have a chat? Which was kind of weird and brilliant and very, very exciting. And so there I was knocking on his door on, I think it was March the 3rd, 2004. I remember the day very, very well. And so that's how it started out. We wrote the series together. We got it to Baby Cow, Steve Coogan's bunch. And the BBC looked like the BBC were interested and were going to do something. And then, how these things are, it all kind of fell apart, sadly. But then a few months later, Rik said, I've been offered this deal to write my autobiography. You write books. How about it? We'll spend a year and a half or whatever together and we'll write this thing. So, yeah, it was like a sort of dream gig. It was fantastic.
That's incredible to be so sort of interwoven with much of Rik's work from 1991 onwards. But also, it must have been very frustrating to have that so close yet so far element with the BBC and with Baby Cow. Had you been a fan even before you got to work with Rik on Godot, and then later on when you were developing your project together? Were you a fan of his? Presumably you were very familiar with his work.
Yeah, massive fan. I was 16 when the first Young Ones series came out. And in actual fact, I'd seen Kevin Turvey on Kick Up the 80s prior to that. And so, this thing, The Young Ones came on and it was like, shit, that is Kevin Turvey. What's Kevin Turvey doing in this show? And so I was kind of intrigued and it just landed. I was 16 with the first series of Young Ones, 18 with the second series of The Young Ones. And it was just perfect. I was the perfect age. And it was weird. I looked on The Young Ones. It wasn't like a kind of comedy troupe, it was like a band. It was like I was into the Clash and the Stranglers and people like that at the time. And it was like The Young Ones were almost like another band. That's how I kind of felt about them, that they were just these sort of really, really kind of different, unusual kind of bunch of guys that kind of completely, I don't know, kind of captured the moment. It was fantastic.
Yeah, they have often been compared to punk rock, actually, The Young Ones, haven't they? So I did.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So first of all, I want to say how jealous I am that you had involvement with the Waiting for Godot thing. Anyone listening to the podcast will know the Waiting for Godot with Rik and Aid is an obsession of mine. And it's like, I constantly joke, if I go back in time, that's what I go see and do, is watch them play Waiting for Godot. So obviously you're very familiar with Rik's work. So briefly, could you say who your favourite characters of Rik are?
Difficult to say favorite cat. I mean, I love Turvey. I've always had a massive soft spot for Turvey. That I love that kind of innocence, and I love that kind of simplicity and kind of vulnerability to him, which was very Rik. When you knew Rik, I would say in many ways Turvey was, you could see that side of him coming through. But I loved all of them, and I loved Rik the poet, fantastic character. I loved Richie Rich. Filthy Rich and Cat Flap was just, it really did it for me. It felt like Ben Elton and Rik together, the sort of writer performer partnership. They were both absolutely on fire. I love Ben Elton's writing, and so for me that was a huge kind of moment really in terms of my love of Rik. And then obviously Bottom came along. I was involved with all the sort of marketing and advertising of the live shows. Well, up until about 95, that's when I kind of disappeared from that company where I was working at that time. But yeah, I loved all of his characters, you know, and I think really the Rik Mayall, which was the character that we created to write the book, was just a continuation of that. You know, it was another kind of Richard character that kind of went on from there. And then, you know, even later on, even in sort of 2011, I was working with Rik. We did a little project at Brunel University, and he played a time traveling hitman called Mr. Richard. So it was like he was always looking for these sort of characters. But yeah, Richie from Bottom, Richie Rich, Rik the poet. I love them all really. But Turvey is very, 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 very much a sort of kind of affectionate character for me.
Stand out.
Yeah,
And the one of his
absolutely.
first as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is almost impossible to choose a favorite Rik character, isn't it? Because you sort of tell yourself, oh, it's definitely Rik the poet, or it's definitely Richard, and then you talk yourself into Flashheart or into Drop Dead
Yeah.
Fred. We recently did a series on Rik's characters,
Yeah, I love it.
looking at looking at them all in turn, and we did sort of say we should really be doing the Rik, which is him obviously in his autobiography, which brings us nicely on to obviously talking about the character that was the Rik in Bigger Than Hitler, Better Than Christ. When you were ghostwriting Rik's biography, how did you and he sort of decide which parts of his life and his many roles that you were going to focus on?
Well, it was kind of a bit sort of piecemeal, really, the whole thing of how we kind of wrote it. So basically, he invited me around to his house. We walked a lot. He loved to walk. He was a great, flaneur, as it, to be use pretentious French expression. And he loved to wander around and sort of see, and he loved being, well, some days he loved being recognized and would be really sweet and lovely to people. And so we were just walking down Portobello Road. It was a Saturday afternoon. It was really busy. And he just told me about this book that he'd been offered and said, do you want to write it with me? And we went into, I think it's the Earl of Warwick pub, which is quite a sort of famous pub down Portobello Road. And we had a drink in there, sort of toasted the fact that we were going to write this together. And we had no plan. He basically said to me, I don't want to write a typical celebrity autobiography. It's the last thing I want to do. He said, my life is private. I feel that I have a very normal family life. I love my wife, love my kids, and I don't want to sort of, dig into all of that. So I want to create a character that is going to be the person who writes his book. And he loved the idea of, being given this big book deal by HarperCollins. And just as, the same with the TV series or the same with all his stuff, it was all about being wrong in whatever medium he was working in. He wanted to be wrong on telly. Turvey was being, a news reporter, but being wrong. And so he said, I want to write this autobiography, but I want to get it completely wrong and make it look like they've given this madman to go away and write this book. And he's got it completely wrong, and he's not going to let him edit it. It's going to be spelled completely wrongly. He's going to talk about the stuff that has happened in his life. I mean, we tried to cover all the stuff he'd actually done, at least mention it, but driven through the prism of this complete lunatic who refuses to have his book edited, who wants to spell everything wrongly, just thinks he's marvelous but isn't. And he saw this very much as this was a new character, and the book was just going to be the beginning of this character. And then we subsequently went on and wrote sort of live things and and other things that Rik was going to do, but in the end, it just ended up pretty much being the book. He said, let's see how it goes. So I would turn up in the morning. I lived in South London. I'd drive up to his place in Ladbroke Grove. We'd have coffee, very strong coffee. He'd be smoking lots of fags. We'd go up to his office at the top of the house, and we just make each other laugh. There were moments, I think, when we started out that he was wrestling with the idea of the autobiography. Sometimes I'd be asking him stuff that he'd done in his life and his career, and he'd say, yeah, let's not do that. He'd tell me stuff, and I've got all this on the archive, where he was actually telling me stuff, that the real stuff, but then he'd be like, yeah, no, let's not go there.
Oh, so he didn't make you turn off the recording at any point. He let you.
He never made me. I think twice he made me turn off the recording in all the time. He used to say to me, "Is it on?" It was always like, "Is it on?" Because he wanted to capture everything. And then he'd do this thing where he'd spit on his left hand and he'd shake my hand, and that was the signal that he was going to tell me a secret. And at that point, I had to turn the recorder off. But even then, a couple of times I forgot. So I've got all sorts of stuff on this archive that is kind of hilariously wrong. But yeah, it was a really kind of odd process, because I look back now and they only gave us a few months. They only gave us a really short amount of time. And we had to write this bloody thing. And it was, and I was paranoid, as I said on that Panglobal Phenomenon thing. I was absolutely paranoid that we were going to get sued, because he hadn't told.
For you as a writer going into that process, and you describe the process as what Rik called jamming with you, or would call imping with Ben Elton, sort of like riffing and improvising, which is where you got over 100 hours of your archive from. As a writer going into that, did you go into it trying to structure it and sort of go, right, Rik, tell me about your childhood, and then we'll move on from there? And did he sort of did he sort of rip that up and throw it out the window and go, no, that's not what we're going to do?
I realised pretty early doors that he was never going to do that.
Right.
I mean, it's funny when I read these reviews and people go, oh, I was really looking forward to a Rik Mayall autobiography, and then it was like, no, he was never gonna do that. It's like saying Bottom was going to be a sort of documentary about middle-aged loneliness or something. It's never going to happen like that. So I learned pretty soon that we weren't going to do that. I think we started off doing the letters, the silly letters, writing to people, and it wouldn't be funny if he wrote to this person. It was basically the idea. We created this character who was this completely over the top, self-aggrandizing lunatic. And then we thought, okay, let's drop him into situations. Let's drop him into sort of book-like situations, like letters and showbiz anecdotes. Because you have to remember, in 2004, this was the sort of golden age of the celebrity biography. People were giving out huge advances to these people, and they were writing these things. And if you look at the kind of book charts from that era, particularly around Christmas, it was all the big stars were writing these things. And Rik, in typical Rik fashion, was like, I just don't want to do that. I'm just so no, I learned pretty soon on. And having worked with him for months already on this sitcom, I knew, we knew what made us laugh. We just literally set about making each other laugh, just from anything that we could come up with in terms of, wouldn't it be funny if the Rik did this, or wouldn't it be funny if the Rik went to the recording of Band-Aid and gets beaten up and thrown out and writes to Bob Geldof and all that, so it was all that kind of stuff, and it was brilliant. I've got probably another third of the book that we decided not to put in, of just these silly letters and silly moments, and it was from a writer's point of view and a Rik fan, it was just a dream come true.
Love to see any more of that material, Max. I mean, it's a wonderful way to explore how to subvert the expectation, and that's what Rik always did, right? And I mean, one of my favorite, the book is, I really loved the book when it came out. I know a lot of people were a bit confused, or maybe disappointed, but I mean, I think it's between the Drop Dead Fred chapter and also the chapter where he really takes the piss out of himself when describing his quad bike accident. That's my favorite moments in it, and you can tell it is, but it's with this sort of absolutely, taking the mickey throughout it as well, isn't it? But there are a few moments of ever so slight kind of a peek behind his real emotions in it, which is fascinating. And did that come out of jamming? Did he sort of talk about that and it came out, or was it sort of
I mean,
you helped him guide that?
would be I'd be sort of prompting him, saying, let's talk about the young ones, or let's talk about bottom, or let's talk, so the quad bike was obviously going to be a key thing in his life, and we weren't sure how to handle it, because you've got this raging egomaniac in the Rik, who he would assume that personality, and I'd be sort of asking him questions, and we'd just be getting it all on the tape. But then when we got to the quad bike, that was a bit later on in the process, and he basically just told it me as it had happened, and exactly, his memories of this weird sort of brain trauma that he'd had, and then we would then sort of make it delivered by the Rik. And that's what some of it was, because what happened was he went off and recorded All About George for ITV. So I knew he was going to be disappearing for about 2 or 3 months. So in that sort of 3-month period, I wrote the first draft from all the tapes. And so I sort of like filtered some of these things through the kind of lens of the Rik. And then we met again, and then we'd go through it. And anybody who ever worked with Rik on a writing side of things would always, even if somebody else had written it, Rik would take a script, and it was, he had an expression for it. He would Rik it up. And that means that he would make it as though through his sort of perception and his point of view. And so we did all of that again that following year. And yeah, so it was a mixture of kind of this sort of lunacy with really honest kind of like confessional stuff, but then all of it was just put into the kind of Rik machine to sort of churn it out according to the mentality of this madman.
What was his first initial feedback on that first draft?
Well, it was an interesting one, because he read the opening sort of few chapters. He read about halfway through, and he loved it. He thought it was funny, and it was very true to what we'd been doing. A lot of it was almost verbatim, from what he'd sort of spoken about. And then I think in the later parts of the book, he felt it wasn't as good. And he felt we'd sort of lost the tone, and we'd lost our way a little bit. I mean, ironic, lost your way with something that was so sort of like form and kind of stream of consciousness. But yeah, he wasn't so sure about that. So we spent a lot of time on the later part of the book, and we cut quite a bit, and we rewrote bits. And it was funny, the sort of joyful fun of the first bit of the process before he went off to do All About George, which was just us literally making each other laugh in a room with a tape recorder. When we'd actually got the first draft and we got into the editing process, it was a different kind of vibe in terms of the writing. We actually had the raw material then, and then we were trying to make it as effective as it could possibly be. And that was a different experience. It was still very funny, and we still had a lot of fun, but this deadline was looming. The publishers were asking for, when we were going to hand this thing over. I think we made the deadline. I think we were maybe a week or two over. But, it became a lot more serious. Maybe not from his point of view, but certainly from mine. I was really kind of lash this thing together. But yeah, it was quite intense. I would go in there every single day, all day pretty much, and drinking lots of very strong coffee. And I used to leave his house feeling really spaced out and lightheaded, and my face would be aching because I'd have been laughing so much at him. But I'd be so full of caffeine that it'd be like, I'd be kind of like all over the place, really.
Did you ever consider not leaving and literally moving in for a while?
Well, the weird thing is, my wife and I, we just had our daughter. And so I was keeping some really weird hours, just doing night feeds and typing things up and all of this. And actually, at the time, Rik was like, I'm going to see Motorhead at Hammersmith Odeon next week, or tonight. Why don't you come with me? Or why don't you come down to the farm in Devon a week and carry on writing there? And I look back on that and I wish, oh God, I wish I'd done that. But unfortunately I couldn't, because we got this little baby at home. So I have a quite a regret that I didn't kind of move in. But there were a few times where he was getting late, and he'd be like, why don't you stay over or whatever. But he was also very funny, like at the end of the day, because I was on a parking meters outside, and I so many times on this recording, he'd just be going, look, it's 10 to 5, fuck off, in his fabulously blunt way,
Did you and Rik ever have any disagreements about the direction or the content of the book? I mean, I know you said there were a few things that were off the record, but Were you generally in agreement of like, this is the gold, this is what's going in?
Pretty much. We kind of knew the character, and we knew how he would behave in certain situations and how he would deliver things. But yeah, I mean, there were a few moments. I remember him one day. We were talking about his sort of childhood, and so he would tell me the truth of his childhood. And so he tells me the story about being at Rashwood County Primary School and being in the carol service and pulling faces, getting his first laughs. I'm going to write about all this in the book, and how that was when he realized that being funny was something that he loved doing. And so he'd tell me that, and then we'd go further and do some silly stuff. And I remember sort of saying, oh, why didn't you do this, as the Rik? The Rik might have done that, or he might have done the other. And I remember him saying to me, God, you're really dark, aren't you? Because these first books that I'd written were really dark comedies. The fiction in particular was very dark. And I remember thinking to myself, you're telling me I'm just kind of crazy. But so sometimes it'd be like, yeah, no, that we can't do that. That is just going too far. That is ridiculous. So there were sort of moments like that. But I think really it was more in terms of the editing process. He would literally obsess over how a word should be spelt wrongly, and how it should be spelt wrongly in the right way. And, that comma shouldn't be there. It should be there. I mean, he was incredibly meticulous in terms of his editing and in terms of his writing. And, that sort of quality control thing with him, I mean, it was quite exhausting, actually, sitting there and working out. And we'd literally be sitting shoulder to shoulder at the desk, looking at the computer, going through this text, going through every single line, and it's about 110,000 word book. So it's quite a big book. And that was really intense. And I wouldn't say we kind of fell out, but we had some quite, spirited arguments about things. And especially on the final kind of read through, the final pass, it was like, is this good enough? Is this chapter good enough? Should this go in? We had with the rule, and I've heard other people who've worked with him have said the same thing, that if it made you both laugh, it was in. If it only made one of you laugh, then it wasn't in. Unless you could unless you could sort of persuade the other one. We had a lot of that going on, and it did. Because of this really tight deadline that we had, and me paranoid that I was going to get sued for all the money, and all this kind of thing. It was kind of weirdly stressful. And also I was massive lack of sleep, being full of caffeine. So yeah, it could get a little bit tense at times, but it was wonderful, really, the process. And hearing him laugh about something that you've come up with, and his generosity in terms of he, there he was, the big star, then me, unknown kind of novelist, but he was so generous that he would make you feel like the funny guy. He was amazing like that. And I've heard that from other writers who work with him.
You didn't feel imposter syndrome in there. He sort of managed to get that out of you pretty much straight away, did he?
Pretty much, because he would laugh at the ideas, and he'd be so generous with stuff. As a writer, I think you often have imposter syndrome. I have it all the time, really. But in terms of working with him, I mean, I used to pinch myself sometimes. I mean, one of the great joys of working with him, and I know other people have spoken about this. I think Ben Alton's spoken about it, and various other people, is that Rik used to love watching himself on TV, right, and watching his performances. One of the great things was we would sit there watching a bit of The Young Ones, or Bottom, or Filthy Rich and Catflap, and he would just be roaring with laughter. This thing of just sitting there watching himself from 20 or 30 years before was just fantastic.
So I wanted to ask about the editing process of that. You said that you wanted to appear as it wasn't edited. Was there ever any pushback from the publishers that didn't understand that these spelling mistakes were intentional, and any mad stuff like that they thought was a bit too off the walls?
No, they were absolutely brilliant. And the guy at HarperCollins, Trevor Dolby, who commissioned the book, and Rik and I got to know him very well. And he was obviously in the Panglobal Phenomenon show, and he's also now my agent. So it's kind of ongoing kind of relationship. But no, Trevor was fantastic. And as I said in that documentary, we thought that he didn't know that he thought he was going to get this, serious or at least sensible celebrity autobiography, and obviously didn't. But he knew all along that we were going to do something very unusual and something very different, and he was fantastic. He'd had issues over the title of the book and had problems with that, I think, at HarperCollins. But he pushed it through. He'd really gone with it. He really believed in it. He did write. There's a little sort of disclaimer at the start of the book where it basically says the publisher would like it known that this is, as the manuscript was delivered by the Rik Mayall, and I think he uses the rather lovely word, any infelicities are very much those of the author. And so he completely went with the joke and really went the extra mile in terms of maintaining the kind of conceit of the Rik character. And in fact, that inside cover, the sort of Easter egg that you get on the inside cover of The Last Supper of all the Rik characters, that was very much his idea. And that was obviously a very expensive thing to do when you're sort of double-sided sort of color printing, and something that he could have easily sort of stepped away from and said, no, this is just a sort of step too far. But, he got that all sorted. So no, actually, Trevor was a complete star and really kind of went the extra mile to make the kind of the very nature of the book sort of true to our idea.
Was Trevor out, or indeed anyone else at the publisher, more worried about one half of the title than they were the other? I'm just wondering, was Bigger Than Hitler a bigger worry than Better Than Christ, or vice versa?
I think it was the kind of collective intake of breath. It was no, I don't think particularly. I mean, it was obviously, it fitted so well with the whole quad bike thing and Dead for 5 Days and all of that. No, I mean, I think there were a lot of eyebrows that were raised at HarperCollins, but no, it was great. And Rik was very much, this is what I want to do. It wasn't so much take it or leave it, because he didn't need to be take it or leave it because Trevor was so accommodating. But it was, it was so true to the character. And, Rik, as I say, wanted to do something that was completely different from all these other sort of overly earnest, sometimes sort of self-lacerating autobiographies that had been churned out at the time. He really wanted to put a marker down that this was going to be different. And we just completely lucked in with a publisher that was very happy for us to do that. And yes, there was a kind of, there was a bit of confusion from some of the fans. But I think a lot of the real sort of diehard fans just loved it because it was Rik being Rik,
What was the critical reaction like at the time? Did critics get what you and Rik were going for, or was there a lot of confusion and pushback against it?
There was a little bit of pushback. I remember we got a really quite a snidey kind of review on Chortle, I think it was. But generally, I mean, the thing with Rik was, he didn't really care what critics thought, and that was what was one of the wonderful things about him. He didn't really pay a lot of heed to critics because they got it so wrong about him throughout his career, and so he was much more interested in what the fans thought. And when we went out on the road for the book tour, and he invited me to come along and said that I needed to be with him so that he could get into character as the Rik, just to see these queues around the block, and they literally were at all these bookshops. I mean, when we were in Manchester, the manager of the Manchester Waterston said that the only other person who'd pulled a crowd even anywhere near as big as Rik's was David Beckham. For Rik, that was confirmation that what he had done was so good, and he didn't care what the critics thought at all. He just saw the fans, they loved it, they were getting into it, they were having fun. He was being the Rik at all these sort of signings, and it was that's what made him happy, not what the critics thought.
Drawing crowds like that obviously showed the appeal of Rik and how so many people just wanted to, have a moment with him to, get the book and get his autograph and tell him how much that they appreciate him and are fans of him. You spend a lot of time with him working, as you mentioned in your radio documentary. You've got over 100 hours of recordings of yourself and Rik in your archive. Have you ever considered releasing more of them, or have you ever had any offers to release any more of them or anything like that?
No, I don't think so. There's a lot of very private stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff that is completely random, that is literally just him and me talking about what's in the news or what we've been doing, or, I don't know, any number of things. There's a lot of very personal stuff. No, I don't think I would ever release more. I mean, what we're thinking of doing with the book is to do a kind of enhanced audio book, so that the book will be read, as per a usual audio book, but then when I'm quoting directly from Rik from the archive, you'll actually get his voice, his lines.
It's one of my I wish there was an audio book of Bigger Than Hitler, Better Than Christ. And was there a reason why? I know it wasn't as popular a format back then, because it would have had to have come out on sort of CD rather than the Audible that we have now. Is that the only reason why it didn't happen?
I don't know why it didn't happen. It could have been a financial thing. Maybe they'd spoken about it, and the money wasn't right. I'm not sure what it was.
So it wasn't that Rik didn't think that it would be right to read it then.
He was all up for it. he was definitely up for it. And for whatever reason, it never happened. I mean, there was a lot of talk of it happening. And we were, they'd spoken about us going into the studio and recording this, and he was really looking forward to that, because obviously at that stage of his career, he was very interested in the idea of being the storyteller.
So to bring us to the present, you're currently researching and writing the only ever authorized biography of Rik Mayall. How has that project come about? We're wondering whether you pitched it to the publisher, whether the family approached you. What was the genesis of this one?
Okay, so really, to answer that, I need to sort of go back to when Rik died. I mean, I was kind of working with him at the time when it happened on a video game with Bob Baldwin, who's obviously a very close friend of Rik's and had directed him in things like Grim Tales and Tales of Uplift and Moral Improvement and all of that. I was with Bob the day that he died, and we were obviously in great shock, and we went to the pub, and it was a weird thing. And I kind of convinced myself that at that moment, even then, I remember thinking somebody's going to write, a real killer book about Rik, sort of authorized thing where with access to his entire life and all the people that he sort of worked with. And, I know there have been a couple of books that have been written, sort of self-published books, but nothing, I thought somebody like William Cook or one of the kind of comedy journalists would come along and write, a really big kind of reflection on Rik's life. And it never happened. And I sort of didn't really think it was ever going to be me. I had all this big archive and I didn't get into it, and I didn't listen to it. I didn't listen to it for years because it was too weird, really, listening to us kind of laughing and joking. And then I think it was 22, something like that, 2023 maybe, I got to know a guy called Simon Nichols, who is a radio producer, works with French and Saunders and Sue Perkins, various different people. And Simon was aware that I, worked with Rik and I'd got this archive. And he said to me, why don't we put a proposal together for Archive on 4 for Radio 4, and let's see if they go for it. And they did go for it. So I then decided I was going to sit there and listen to all 114 hours of this archive, which was a really weird but kind of wonderful experience. And there was a lot of laughter. There was actually a lot of tears as well. It was kind of it was a weird kind of emotional roller coaster. But I listened to everything, and I whittled it down to a sort of 2.5 hour edit of, great moments of him laughing and great moments of him being sort of funny and silly and us just sort of jamming together. Obviously that came out, and the family were wonderful and really supportive and helpful, and they loved the show, and it all went down very well. And then I was kind of left, I had this sort of sense of anticlimax almost, that I'd really worked incredibly hard with Simon Nichols on this project. It kind of went quiet for me. That was when I decided, well, I'm going to have to do something more with this. Oh, and just to say, when I was working on the radio show, I mentioned Simon, but Gareth Gwynn was the director of the show, and he was brilliant. I mean, he was so good at sort of putting this whole thing together, and I had so much fun working with Gareth on this. And as I say, this fed into this sense of anticlimax. I had lunch with Trevor Dolby. I said to him, well, I'm thinking maybe of writing something else about Rik. What do you think? And so one thing led to another, and he said, well, put together a proposal and see if we can get the family on board. And I spoke to Barbara and Sid, Rosie, and Bonnie, and they were up for it. And so I put this proposal together, and it went out, and literally it was sort of snapped up very quickly. And one of the things I was trying to do with the book is trying to do something a little bit different, in that, I'm sort of digging not only into what made Rik in terms of the sort of, his family and his background, but also the sort of culture from which he came, the whole idea of, punk, and what was happening in Manchester in 1975 and 1976, and what was happening in London, in Soho, in 1980 and 1981, and all this sort of stuff. So I want it to be very much a biography of a legend, but also a sort of investigation into the culture from which he sprang. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from. But I one of the chapters in the book is going to be called The Accidental Biographer, because I never, I'm a novelist. I write screenplays and stories, and so I never thought that I would ever write a biography. It wasn't anything that had ever sort of crossed my radar. So it just kind of just a sort of accident of fate, really, that I ended up writing this.
But do you find having more of a story background and stuff will help you shape a person's life into a natural narrative?
Absolutely. No, I mean, one of the things, I'm as part of the research process, I'm reading a lot of comedians' biographies, and a lot of them are very sort of formulaic. And I'm, you don't want to break that formula too much because it's tried and trusted and people love it. But yes, as a novelist, I want to try and be a bit more kind of experimental and try and do something slightly different in certain places. And I don't want it to all be, and then he did this and then he did that, and it's going to be this sort of straight chronology. I'm going to try and break it up a little bit and actually have Rik talking about his life, as he did when we were working, when we were jamming for the original book back in 2004. So yes, I think in terms of that sort of slightly more experimental nature of the writing, yes, I do want to try and get into that. I don't, I when I'm writing and when I'm thinking about these things, it's almost like I can hear Rik's voice, in my ear, just as I did when he was sitting next to me for all those months. And and he wouldn't want me to make it a completely formulaic, sort of celebrity biography. Now, I'm not going to go as far as we did with his autobiography in terms of the Rik and the lunacy of that. I think we did that, and that is what it is. But I do want to try and make it a little bit more kind of unusual, and certainly, from my kind of novelist background, I guess that does help to some degree.
How have you been finding the research process? Have people been mostly receptive to interview requests because it's Rik, because the subject is Rik, or I'm just wondering how's the research process been going for you so far?
Oh, it's been great. I mean, it's since I got the deal back in I think it was sort of May, June time, I've been reading everything about Rik, every sort of book that I can find, and articles and documentaries and everything I can sort of lay my hands on. And I've got over 100,000 words of sort of notes now that I'm sort of shaping into the different chapters and everything. But as far as the interviews are concerned, I decided that I was going to try and speak to as many people as I possibly could. So I'm speaking to people who were with him at Manchester University, speaking to people who were on the American tour that he went on in 1978 when he left Manchester, and speaking to people from all sort of parts of his life. And everybody thus far has been wonderful, and it's funny, quite a few of them have been like, telling me funny stories, but then saying, yeah, actually, you can't put that in the book because,
Sure. Have there been any big contradictions that you've come up with, some stories about Rik? Is there anything that...
That's an interesting question, because the thing about Rik is that he never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So there are stories that he told me that I've then subsequently spoken to other people about, and they will have a different take on it. And it's almost like he sort of embellished certain things, and then somebody would go, no, actually, this is how it happened. But then somebody else, I mean, some of these things, you're going back sort of 50 years, really, stuff from when he was young. People's memories obviously aren't that brilliant. So sometimes I've got like a story of something that Rik's done, and I've got about, I've got his version, and I've got like 2 or 3 other versions that other people have told me. and they're all different. So it's like, oh, okay, so how am I going to manage that?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because the story of someone's life, once they have gone, does actually become what other people say about them as well, or what you have
Yeah,
obviously put into, what you have told as a story, and then that becomes what people share, and therefore it becomes the truth, doesn't it? So
yeah,
I think actually in Aid's autobiography he talks about how Rick went round as if everyone he met was writing his
yeah.
biography,
Very true.
because he wanted people to have happy, funny memories of him.
Oh
And
yeah.
I mean, I cannot wait to read your book, Max. I
Oh,
think
thank you.
we all feel that way. Talking to you now just makes me feel even more. I'd love to be helping you out with the research process. Listening to all of those tapes must be absolutely weighty, but incredible to have there as an archive. So I know
Yeah.
you said it's kind of fallen into your into you as a task, but I mean, there's no one better place to do it, is there, Max?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, I think it was making that radio show with Simon and Gareth that really made me realize that actually I didn't want anybody else to do it. It
Yeah.
suddenly hit me, after 10 years after he died, it was like, hold on a minute. If somebody else came along and now said they were going to do this real deep dive into Rick's life, I would feel kind of miffed. I would be pissed off because I feel that I want to be the one to do that because we were close, we'd become friends. And so I think I felt a weird kind of ownership in a funny sort of way
Yeah.
about trying to tell his story and telling it, in the way that it should be told because he was different from how people sort of perceive him to be. There were many different sides to him. Based on the characters that he played, you'd think he was a certain sort of person. But in actual fact, when he was talking about certain things in his life and you'd see a sort of emotional vulnerability to him that you wouldn't have expected from somebody like him. I want to try wherever possible to sort of capture as much of the kind of three-dimensional character of who Rick was, as much as I can.
Absolutely. And this is, of course, the authorized biography. And there have been several unofficial books about Rick and his work. Is there been a change in terms of how close you've been? Obviously, you've been close with his family. Are they really close in informing your research for
They
things?
they really are. I mean, they're so great. Obviously, I got to know them when I was working with Rick because I was working with him in the family house, in the family home. So I got to know them well, and they've been so supportive and so generous in terms of their time and obviously I spoke to Sid, Rosie, and Bonnie for the radio, but I'm going to be speaking to them again and speaking to Barbara and then Rick's siblings, Anthony, Libby, and Kate. They've been wonderful, with details and recollections and stories from childhood and all throughout his life. So I think getting Rick's story from his family is going to really make this hopefully very special because we're going to really get into his development both as a sort of person but also as a performer and a writer and a comedian. So yeah, I mean they've been wonderful. They really have. Yeah.
This year's been the Rik Mayall Comedy Festival, the inaugural Rik Mayall Comedy
Yes.
Festival. It does feel that, obviously we're 11 years now since Rick sadly passed away, and it does feel that as time's moved on, people are even more keen to actually, let everyone know who Rick was and not forget about him. That's one of the reasons we started this Talking Bottom podcast, and it really does. I mean, it's great that you're going to have the book out in time for what would have been Rick's 70th birthday. It feels incredible, really, that so much time has gone by without him here now. And I wanted to ask, is there anything you've discovered so far that has shocked you or made you laugh that you're able to share with us, or are you holding it all back for the book?
There have been lots of sort of funny moments that people have told me about in terms of what he got up to, away from the stage and away from the cameras and things that he did. I mean, this was the thing about Rick was that he didn't really care whether he was entertaining millions down a camera lens or whether it was just you sitting across the table from him, having a cup of coffee. He would just want to make you laugh. He would want to be funny. So yeah, I've heard various sort of stories which yeah, I'm gonna be a real tease now, and I'm kind of saving them for the book.
Knew
But
you would.
you knew I would, but yeah, no, very much so. I mean, yeah, there are lots of funny things that he got up to. He was, he had. I know it's a corny thing to say about, a comedian or a comic or a comedy writer, but he had funny bones. He was just hilarious. He could make me laugh. And the wonderful thing about working with Rik was that if you kind of if he knew you and you were kind of close, he'd know what made you laugh, and he'd just do stupid things like he'd just go and get a cup of coffee, walk back into the room, and walk into the door, like just sort of stupid things because he knew it made me laugh. And he'd do the ear thing, and where he'd hold his ear, and all, just stuff that was funny. I mean, there was one thing I can tell you one story where we went to lunch with a TV producer, quite a serious TV producer, and we went to this sort of swanky restaurant. We were pitching an idea for one of these story projects, because I wrote lots of little short stories with Rik, which have never to this day or yet seen the light of day. But we were sitting there with this guy, and we decided we were going to have a competition to see how many times we could use the word sticky during the lunch with this guy who we decided we were going to call Sticky, and that was the kind of nickname that we'd kind of given him. And so we just had this ridiculous meeting that was meant to be very serious, where we were just keeping a tally of how many times we could drop the word sticky into the conversation. And I think at one point Rik was concerned that I was maybe winning. He just finished off with this sort of ridiculous kind of final sentence to this guy before he wandered off, looking very confused as to what the hell was going on. And basically every other word was sticky. And it made absolutely no sense whatsoever, but kind of appealed to our very childish senses of humor. So that was one. Yeah.
That's a lot. I mean, that's a lovely moment that you guys share together, and it's great that you have those moments with him, and people, even those of us who never met him or got to work with him, all think of him so fondly and miss him, and we're really looking forward to the book. We'll leave you with this final question. We know it's not written yet, or it's still in the research process, and you're shaping your notes. But what do you think Rik would make of his official biography?
I think hopefully he'd be pleased that it's me that's writing it. I think hopefully he'd be pleased by that. But I think he would just think it was a bit of a nonsense, really, that a sort of conventional biography should be written about him. But what I'm trying to do is just capture him and capture what he was like and how he behaved and how funny he was. And so hopefully with that in mind, and if I can be true to that and I can be true to him, I think he'd be pleased.
I really hope your book doesn't take as long as our one took. You sound like you know what you're doing, though, so probably.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I can talk a good game, but yeah, it is. I am kind of slightly nervous about it, but you guys did brilliantly with your book and the podcast. I love it. So you've done really well with all of that.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Max. And if anyone hasn't already got you on socials, because you share a few little snippets of Rik and things on your Insta and all that kind of thing. Do you want to do a shout out for anyone who can find you if they need to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter, but that's where I'm normally shouting about Donald Trump or something. But no, I mean, I've set up this Instagram account, which is purely devoted to the book, and it's just my name, at Max Kinnings. And it's completely devoted to just little bits of snippets of research. And obviously, as the book gets further down the line and the publication hoves into view, it'll get a lot more busy. But I'm just putting a few little things up there.
Yeah, it's glorious. You shared Rik laughing on one of your stories recently, and it really just cheered me up to hear that in the day on socials.
He had the world's greatest laugh.
He did.
I would fight anybody who tries to disagree with me on that. Yeah, no, he had this incredible laugh. So I just wanted to try and capture that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And he shared it, right? He made us all laugh along with him. That's why we love him so much. And if anyone can we pre-order your book yet, Max?
Not yet, but I think about probably about a year out from publication day. But I've got to write the bloody thing first.
Yeah, okay.
It's going to be hard work.
We'll be there. We'll be ready. But if everyone follows you, they'll know where they can get their hands on it then when it's out and available to buy.
And
Fantastic.
for now, best of luck with the writing process.
Thank you very much.
We can't wait to see the finished product. Max, thank you very much.
I'd love to speak to you guys about your love of Rik. There'll be a chapter I'm planning, the later part of the book about Rik and how his it's almost like his sort of fame has spread really since his passing. So it'd be lovely to talk to you guys about that and
that would be brilliant.
But there's no way we'd say no to that. That sounds amazing.
Brilliant. Okay,
we'd be incredibly honoured to in any way help inform your book, Max.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we've taken up all of your precious time tonight, Max. Thank you so much for joining us talking Bottom. If we can just say to our listeners, if you aren't following us already, please do follow us on @TalkingBottom on all the socials. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks
Bye.
for listening.
Bye.